Hello, I'm going to be talking to you today about embedding PCI DSS into your organization's security compliance program. And before we get started, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So my name is Matthew Davies. I'm the VP of Product at SureCloud. Before joining SureCloud, I spent time at PwC and Deloitte working in IT risk assurance and GRC technology. I'm also responsible for the planning and execution of our GRC products. And I've worked and advised a lot of customers about how to build a control framework and embed that within their organization and use technology to enable that. So let's start with some of the key takeaways from today's session. So I think the first thing to think about is if we take PCI or any compliance requirement, how can you simplify and streamline the management of multiple compliance requirements, irrespective if that's PCI, NIST, or ISO, or it could be anything. We're also going to look at how you can map compliance requirements to an overarching aligned compliance framework, talk through some practical steps of how your organization can go and move to a test once, satisfy many requirements, and obviously explain that in a bit more detail further on in the presentation, and then learn about the stage of where once you have those compliance requirements, how you can actively monitor them and build live compliance documentation to significantly improve and streamline your compliance testing regime. Before we get started, one of the other things is always to kind of recap on some of the challenges that today's security and compliance professionals are facing. So the first thing we always see is the balance of making sure business is done quickly, but at the same time securely. So many organizations are always battling with this, and it's something we hear from a lot of our customers and people that we work with. The other one is that there is an ever-increasing number of compliance requirements. I think everyone would have said, yeah, I've got a few to manage, but we'll talk through a little bit more how they've got more complicated and how that, as the image there, is kind of the tip of the iceberg of things that you need to manage. Next one is identifying and simplifying. A lot of organizations will see that they have a lot of very similar compliance requirements where they're almost saying the same thing, but how can they identify and simplify those overlapping requirements, because business stakeholders often don't understand why there's different things they're being asked for, which are almost identical. And finally, reducing that testing and evidence collection burden. Anyone who works in this space knows it is an extremely time-consuming exercise to make sure that on whatever frequency you're collecting evidence, you're testing it, and there's a lot of pressure on business stakeholders to do this. So let's start by, one of the things I like to do is start by looking at these as questions. So let's look at how does compliance get so complicated? So how does this get so complicated? Many organizations start with something in mind, or be a thing that they want to be compliant to or they need to be. So that could be PCI, it could be ISO, it could be NIST if you're wanting to align yourself to it. And what happens to organizations is, well, you enter new business areas. Organizations often start to sell new products. They start to buy or consume new businesses that they're going into, or even the nature of the business that you're doing changes, i.e. you're entering new markets to sell it. And what happens is you get things like new contracts. So new contracts come in. There is you'll need to be SOC 2 certified. There's a bunch of other things that your organization is now saying, actually, you need to meet these compliance requirements to work in this country. New people come in, and as new people come in, they have new ideas and things that they want to attest to. They want to make sure your organization is compliant with. You want to increase maturity. So a lot of organizations will say, actually, we want to make and this isn't adding more requirements, but it's making the complexity of what's being asked much, much more complex. The other one here is regulatory change. We all know that regulations don't stand still, they adapt and they change. Irrespective if it's new business areas or business change, the same things happen. And yes, the business change may be less things to do, but as these things adapt, organizations end up with something like this. And again, it could be more, it could be less, but you end up with a lot of different requirements that your organization needs to manage. The thing with these requirements is they're very, very similar. So in this example, I'm going to walk through how multiple overlapping requirements, in this case, it's quite easy to dissect. It's a policy. So if we look at, I'm not going to talk through every single one of these, but I'll highlight the key things that most of them are saying. So if we take the ISO requirement here, it's saying you need to have a policy. It's been approved, reviewed by management. It's communicated, and the relevant people understand if anything changes. So we'll look at NIST. Obviously, it's a lot simpler, saying you need policies that are established and communicated. We look at PCI. PCI here that's saying, again, you have these policies that govern, etc., etc. And then finally, COBIT. One of the things that you notice here is they're similar but not the same. So if you're asking stakeholders to go and test these things, obviously they feel like they're being asked to do the same thing over and over and over again. I'm probably being a bit unfair here. For a policy requirement, this is quite easy to identify, but for other compliance requirements, it's not as obvious as this. So we've shown you there how you can see and how it gets complicated, but what can you do about it? So how can you address these overlapping requirements? So one of the things to think about here is you've got all these requirements. You probably should be looking at a baseline compliance framework. So what is that? I mean, a baseline compliance framework is basically taking an overarching view of all of your regs, standards, internal policies and procedures, and creating an overarching compliance framework. And the reasons that you would do this is that it simplifies your security and compliance mandate. One of the things that we don't often talk about that I think is really important is there is a consistent format and language to how a control is described. I think a lot of time you're asking business stakeholders to go and test controls, but they look very different. They may be described differently. They're to different levels of detail. You can have a consistent format and language for an organization of how these things are. This then allows you to do, as I said before, this test once controls satisfy many. Here you can say, we have a singular password control, we have a singular policy control, or multiple. But this allows you to test that and say, well, we test this as an ongoing basis, but for our ISO certification, here's all the evidence. If there's a different certification you have to do, again, it's there. This allows you to then reduce that evidence collection because you're asking them to do it once, and that can be reused throughout the organization. So where can you start with a baseline compliance framework? Well, the first thing to think about here is a baseline compliance framework, you can build your own. This is the easiest way to get the most, I would say, highly tailored one to your organization. But some of the things you need to think about here is the level of skills that you need to do this. Do you have the people within your organization that can do this? Do you have the time to do this? And then once you've also built it, do you have the people to maintain it? Because these things adapt over time. But it does give you a very, very bespoke and aligned to your organization's needs if you have it. The second option is you can pay for a consultancy firm to do this. Again, there is a cost element to this of it can cost quite a lot of money. So you have to think about, is that something we want to do? The second thing is, on top of the costs, you still have to maintain it. So have you got the skills and people to maintain it once it's been handed over? If not, are you going to have to go back again every couple of years to help them keep on top of it? The third is you can buy an off-the-shelf set. There are organizations out there where you can get these. The ISF have the standards of good practice. There's also the Unified Compliance Framework where you can get this from. There are things out there that are off the shelf. Again, these need to be tailored and they can be quite expensive. And again, they might not be everything that your organization needs, but they're a good starter for 10. The other one here is leverage a free source, and there are a few of these. I know NIST have done this with mapping in other requirements than NIST CSF, but one of the ones I really like is a secure controls framework. We'll also attach, as part of this, a link to that so you can get to it, but it's a great free source. And before you look at any of these, I think you should have a look at this to go, what does a baseline compliance framework look like, and would that be something our organization could deal with? So now we've looked at how does it get complicated and what can we do to simplify it? So how do we simplify the testing once we've got that streamlined framework? So what are the challenges with the current approach to compliance testing? I mean, I think anyone who does this knows that they're very manual, repetitive and disparate. You're asking for people over and over again to do things, and often it's not from a singular place. It's like, here's a spreadsheet, can you fill it in and send me some evidence because we've got an audit? Then you get another one a couple of weeks later that's slightly different. Very repetitive, and people just feel like they've been asked to do the same thing over and over again. One of the other things is it's a point-in-time assessment of compliance. You test it, and a lot of the time, a bit tongue-in-cheek, is people leave it alone and don't check it again for 9 months until the next audit. Better organisations or more advanced may be checking it on an ongoing basis, but a lot of time it's done and then people forget about it. So you're asking to make data or making decisions on data that may not be up to date. It's seen by stakeholders to slow down the business, especially if it's inefficient. They feel like another compliance check, we have to do another one, and they don't feel like it's actually adding value to the business. And you end up creating hundreds of documents that often aren't reused. You create these documents and then they're there, And then the next time is you just create them again. So people just end up being very frustrated doing the same thing over and over and over again. So how can you simplify compliance testing? So what we're going to talk about here is continuous compliance, and that is not continuous control monitoring. Continuous control monitoring could be a component of continuous compliance. So what I'm going to do is a little bit talk through what is continuous compliance. So continuous compliance for me is about managing your compliance requirements proactively throughout the year based on the scope. So that could be your IT, your business environment, but it's shifting your organization into creating a proactive culture and, again, strategy. So this culture and strategy is really important to test and review compliance on an ongoing basis. So I'm going to talk through some of the components of a continuous compliance program. So one of the things to think about here is it is not just a technology problem. It is, again, let's start with people. In order for this to be successful, you need to develop that proactive strategy and culture. If people don't buy in that this is something that makes sense for our organization, it's never going to be successful. So you need the people to buy in by explaining to them that this is going to reduce that manual collection and it's going to give people their valuable time back, but it's going to take some time up front to do that. This isn't going to be like we click our fingers and it's just there and everything's perfect, but that investment will simplify things as we go on. We've obviously got the processes, so you've got to have the people that need to buy in, but we need those standardized processes where this is how we test controls, this is how we're going to assess controls, this is where we're doing it from, and it removes those duplicate activities. So we know here's our standardized framework, here's how we're going to test it, and when we're doing that, it removes duplicate activities and really simplifies the testing and evidence collection. And then finally, technology. I mean, you theoretically can do this without technology, but you do need to automate compliance workflows. In order for this to scale, you need to use technology, be either a GRC tool, a compliance tool, or some technology to make sure that you're automating these assessments. Otherwise, you end up with a lot of manual activity and administration overheads. There's people and organizations I've worked with before where it's someone's full-time job. It's just sending out these questionnaires, reviewing them, collating all the evidence together and creating reports. And that becomes a full-time job. And you're paying really, really expensive staff to do that. So leveraging technology to automate some of these manual activities frees them up to focus on making better processes and dealing with the issues within your organization. So what makes a continuous compliance program? I think the first one is collaboration between stakeholders. In order for this to work, you need the business, compliance teams, security teams to work together to understand actually, by simplifying this, aligning this, we can make this a lot better for everyone. Second one is ongoing assurance. You're moving from those ad hoc audits that we do for each of our compliance programs or certifications to an ongoing assurance where we're saying, actually, we're going to assess our controls on an ongoing basis, irrespective of which compliance regime it is. We can then generate them and we have up-to-date data or near real-time data to make sure we're making informed and sensible decisions. It allows us to create live compliance documents or near live, where actually when we need to do an audit, I can generate that and I've got my compliance document. So I can say, actually, we've got PCI, we've got an ISO certification or whatever it is. We can generate it and we've got up-to-date documents, and actually that audit preparation is so much easier on the business. It allows you to automate manual processes, so you're moving away from ad hoc, non-repeatable processes to repeatable automation of those manual processes to collect the evidence and test. This is not exactly a component of a continuous compliance program, but one of the things I would say here is if you don't standardize and rationalize those controls, you can end up with that you're doing a lot of work. So I think you probably should look at standardizing and rationalizing your control set as a component of a continuous compliance program. So now we're going to talk about continuous control monitoring, and this isn't the same as continuous compliance. It can be a component of continuous compliance. So let's just have a little recap on what that is. So what is CCM? CCM is technology that can be used to continuously monitor your controls. Basically, you're integrating to systems to understand in near real time where actually those controls have failed or there is something that you've identified that you may want to look at. So there's a lot of organizations now looking at this to support their compliance programs. So why would you want to do this? I mean, the first thing is it even further simplifies your compliance testing. It will allow you to save time and money because there's no human checking it as it goes on. Another one is continuous improvement, is you are actively, as part of a continuous compliance program, seeing if something if it's not working or it's degrading, you can continue to actually improve that over time. And it gives you better data-driven decision making. I think this is the most important thing, is you're making decisions even on more up-to-date data, which makes it easier for you to make the right decision to take this forward. So I'm going to talk through a little example of this. Again, this is really simplified, but in a CCM tool, you set up the logic, or again, this could be some scripts that you've written yourself. You set up some logic to check something like privileged account management, so to make sure if people leave or if they've moved teams that they're not accruing lots of permissions that they shouldn't have. You retrieve and analyze the account data from a source system, so wherever this is going to be, and then you update the control ratings based on the system, on the rules that you've set up. So if people have got correct segregation of duties, they've got the accounts that have been removed, or etc., it will then say that there's no non-conformities and this process is working as expected. So what are the key takeaways for your compliance program? So I think there's a few things here, so we'll talk through the practical steps. I think the first one is you need to develop that overarching strategy and mission for your organization, because if you haven't done that, the reality is you're never going to get buy-in to do this kind of thing, because if everyone doesn't see the value in bringing this together and you haven't got senior level buy-in, you're going to really struggle with this. Second one is the scope. So make sure you've thought about the appropriate regs, frameworks and standards that you want to put in scope, and be realistic. You're probably not going to do this all first time. So higher value items where you can demonstrate value quickly, be that be PCI or ISO, whatever it is, you can then bring that in and then you can add to this as time goes on. Second one is make sure you've got the policies, procedures and testing as an overarching thing to support this. Make sure you've identified the critical assets, services and business areas. So again, probably don't do everything at once. Say this is a business area we're going to again work with, and then build it out as time goes on. This then allows you to have that standardized control set that makes sense, and you can identify and implement the appropriate controls. You can then test, review and improve controls, but you're doing this in a consistent way. This is where you can look at in things like CCM or monitoring to test and can get continuous insights over what's going on. And then that allows you to look at live compliance documentation and communicate updates in real time. So when things aren't working, you can tell and you can act on it very, very quickly. So a little bit how SureCloud can help. So one of the things SureCloud does is we work with a bunch of providers out there. So again, the UCF, the ISF, if you're members of them or you've bought them. We also have a partnership with the Secure Controls Framework and a bunch of other things that we work with. You can help standardize your compliance framework using our compliance solution, help with our automatic scheduling to help you schedule and conduct those tests and evidence collection much easier. Have a single source of truth so you can look at how those regs and standards behave across all of your business entities, etc. And we can work with tools to automate the collection and analysis of data from third-party systems to monitor compliance. And that allows you to have those live compliance documents and track remediation and exceptions in real time. So you get that single pane of glass view of compliance for your organization. So I guess there's three key recommendations here. I think the first one is don't reinvent the wheel. I think, to be honest, use a pre-mapped compliance framework. I think the SCF is brilliant. It's free. It's a good starting point. So have a look at that. See if that works for your organization before you go down this path. One of the other things to say here is you don't have to have just one control. So in some cases where you might have more complex versions of a control, maybe just for one business area, it's okay to do that rather than trying to make it really complex for every part of your organization. Focus on reducing mundane and repetitive tasks. If you can do this, you can show value quickly. And this allows you to embed that test once, satisfy many requirements, and you can see you'll get a lot of business buy-in, and people want to be part of this program. So it will help you with getting this program off the ground. And then finally, once you've got that testing, you've got a single framework, look at proactively monitoring your controls. So you're not waiting for those yearly audits, you're assessing at an ongoing basis, be by regular assessments or technology monitoring this. So thank you very much for listening. There's a link to my LinkedIn down there. If you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.